Today I'm chatting with Rachel Rae Halder. Rachel, also known as Rae, is a seasoned somatic trauma resolution practitioner whose work currently focuses on sexual healing, codependency, and sovereignty. She often works with coaches, healers, and leaders who've done all the work and yet still sense their unseen life degenerating patterns dictating their reality. Her work goes far beyond the typical somatic experiencing principles and enters into the nature and energetic or mystical realms of the unseen. She currently lives in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the original home of the Tiwa, also known as Taos, New Mexico. Welcome, Rachel. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
I've been following you for a while on Facebook and Instagram, and when I think of you, I really think of somatic trauma healing, specifically related to pleasure and embodiment, and really kind of reclaiming that. And that your work really aligns with the wisdom of our bodies instead of bypassing it, which I've personally experienced some pleasure modalities doing. So I'm curious if you can orient us to kind of maybe how some approaches related to sexuality miss the mark for folks who've experienced trauma.
Yeah, for sure. So my experience with this, like a little background, is I went to like traditional talk therapy around sexual abuse for a while. And that helped to an extent, but it got to the point where talking about it was no longer useful because I could tell it was like my therapist even said to me, "Oh, it seems like you're actually okay around this." But I was like, "Oh, but my body is still having these reactions or these experiences." Like I could tell I was still having a freeze response. So then I started searching, the World Wide Web. And because I was kind of more of this mystical spiritual person, I stumbled upon tantra and I stumbled upon like jade egg practices and these kind of deeper, like somatic and energetic practices around sexual healing. And those were really profound for me. But what I realized after doing like a lot of extensive work in that realm, so doing a ton of tantra practices and doing like a lot of energetic work, was that because I hadn't done like the preparatory work for those kinds of like deep practices, and I was in a coaching program, so I was doing like half an hour to an hour of these practices a day. But because I didn't have this like baseline of safety and stability as like the like groundwork for those practices, I didn't realize that I was overriding my own nervous system most of the time while I was doing those practices. And so then that actually eventually led to a big crash, which I see happening a lot. And so a lot of people go into maybe a tantra retreat, or they'll do the like screaming practices where you're kicking a pillow or kicking, like punching a pillow, kicking your feet. You might be doing like all this energy clearing kind of work, but if there hasn't been actual authentic consent in the body, consent meaning every single part of you is like on board and like, yeah, let's do it. What we end up doing is actually almost recreating abusive dynamics within ourselves because we're pushing ourselves and we're pushing past our capacity and we're going into doing practices that are actually just like a little more like they're just too advanced for where we are at. And that's not to say those practices are advanced practices. It's just like the way bodies work. Like there's actually like preparatory work that we should be doing before we just launch into like a huge tantra ritual or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. I kind of discovered the extent of my sexual trauma when I was in a sexuality program, and it was over Zoom, and the Friday session was orgasmic meditation, which my naive self did not know what that was. And I was like, oh, we're going to meditate.
Totally.
And then I was like, oh, no, you mean on Zoom, we're all going to stroke our pussies? And just immediately like shut down, disassociated, crying. And I was just like, what is happening? Like, here I am saying, I signed up for something that I thought was going to make me feel more pleasure. And it actually kind of spiraled me in the other direction. And it was so disorienting, and it made me feel more broken because here's this medicine that's worked for so many people that isn't working for me.
Totally. And I think that's like a big like kind of issue, if you want to call it that, within these kinds of practices, is that a lot of the people guiding this work like, I don't think it's because they have malintent or anything. I think it's just they actually don't understand how to fully work with someone who has had sexual trauma. And I'm not defining sexual trauma as like you've had an abusive experience. Like that could be the case. Like maybe you did experience sexual, like childhood sexual assault or something like that. But like sexual trauma can just be like being like looked at by men like your entire life, or it could be growing up in like a Christian church where purity culture is like the main message that you hear, and so you are coming towards your sexuality with this idea that like it's wrong or bad. And then if you're thrown into the fires of this like super vulnerable experience where everyone is like touching themselves, and there's like a setup that like this is supposed to be something, or there's like this assumption that it's supposed to be powerful, or it's supposed to be orgasmic, or it's supposed to be transformational on some level, and there isn't the prep work even in that like context of like this might be the experiences you have, these might be the trauma responses that you have, this is what you do if you have those trauma responses. If none of that is laid out, then it definitely often, way more often than I think people realize, it creates like re-traumatization patterns inside of people, which like you said, it like it's kind of backfires. It's like it actually like it like sure it brings up the trauma, which might be good, especially if you don't know you have it, but it also just like super triggers the nervous system and puts someone into a highly vulnerable position. And if they don't know where to go with that, it's really scary and isolating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to your point of like, can the body actually consent? And I think cognitively we can want to heal these parts of us that are maybe not what we want them to be. Like we're not experiencing the pleasure that we want to be. But if our body isn't actually able to say, yes, this feels safe, I want to do this, then whatever the medicine, quote unquote, that we're giving it is not going to work. It's going to, like you said, dysregulate us and re-trigger us. Yeah. Mm.
Exactly. And I think that's like the biggest thing. Like I talk about that a lot, like the war between the mind and the body. And if we're kind of like the idealistic person, or like when I first got into this work like 10 years ago, I was very like, I don't know, like I want to be so compassionate towards like my 20-year-old self. Like I think I was like a typical 20-year-old, but it, like in my 20s, but it was like very much like the world is my oyster. Like there's so many possibilities. Like I can have anything I desire, anything I want. And I often had no clue what my body was communicating to me. But because I had such strong ideas of who I should be and how I wanted to be and how I should feel and how that should look, I would constantly go towards that and like almost like run towards it, giving no heedance to like what was actually somatically going on in my body, which was like parts of me screaming like, stop, like this is terrifying, like why are you forcing us into all these vulnerable situations and these vulnerable practices, and like it was just too much. And one of the colloquial terms for trauma that I like to use is just too much, too fast, too soon. And so what I realized in my own experience was that I was literally recreating my original sexual imprint that happened to me as a child and as a teenager, which was exactly that, like too much, too soon, too fast. And how I was then just doing it to myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Isn't that amazing how we do that? And of course, like how our culture shapes us. And, you know, I'm sure your instinct to like run and do is got you far in life in many ways. Because that's how our culture operates. Yeah. I would love to hear more about your story, of course, only as much as you feel compelled to share. But kind of the personal and the professional, and how you wove these things and the things that you tried, and kind of how you got to this moment in your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like I kind of mentioned a bit about doing talk therapy and then how that led into researching and exploring more somatic work around it, because I did realize, oh, a lot of this is in my body. And I wrote I did a master's thesis on the suppression of sexuality in the Christian church, and naming it a form of spiritual trauma. And then also naming how one can't just like change their thoughts around religion or change their ideas around God or shift their doctrine or dogma around sexuality, that like because it is such an embodied experience, and our relationship with spirit or nature or whatever you want to call that, like other, you know, kind of more unseen realms, um, how that relationship is often disrupted for people who grew up in those kinds of dogmas or doctrines, because they get such an inherent message of like, if you're a sexual being, you are bad. So it's literally separating you from self, like from this inherent innate like way of being in your body, um, and then separating you from God or spirit or whatever you want to call that other thing. So that was very much a part of my journey. Like I grew up Mennonite. I grew up not around like explicit purity culture. Like it wasn't like, well, I mean, sort of. It wasn't as much as maybe like an evangelical church would offer, but it was definitely like sexuality is something that like we just do not talk about, period. Like it doesn't exist. Like no one is a sexual being. Like sex is just off the table in terms of conversation. And it was definitely like implied that like you shouldn't have sex. Like that was definitely a big implication. Um, and yeah, it really, that like the conflict between one being sexually abused as a child and then two, being in a sexual relationship at the age of 15, which there's power imbalances within that because it was with a 19-year-old. There's all sorts of context within that. But even within that, it was like there was such an internal conflict inside of my like teenage body around like good girl versus being this like horrible person who was sexually explorative and had these sexual experiences that were actually not consensual, but it was even like I couldn't even understand that they were non-consensual because there was so much like silence around that sexual world. So I just heaped it onto myself and felt like, oh, this was all my fault. So that led me into going to therapy in my 20s and then exploring this embodiment work, and then doing my master's degree and writing that thesis on that, which is actually a free book. So if people are listening and interested in that, they can download it on the internet. But then I did a coaching program, a sex, love, and relationship coaching program. And in that was when I was kind of doing like hour-long practices every day. And that was a super transformational experience, so powerful, so radical on so many different levels. Like I got to know myself in ways that I had never known myself, and got to experience things in my body that I had never experienced. But then so I ran into that, like I said, like full charge. I was a very high achiever, and what I didn't understand at that point in time was the way my trauma played out in my system was through achieving in life. So I was like a good girl who did things 100%. So I went into that coaching program with that mentality. I did every single practice that was offered to me. I showed up 100%, and that was like way blowing out my capacity. Like it was just way too much. And so then but it was like that validation and self-worth. It was like, oh, I have to do it in this way in order to feel worthy, or in order to feel like validated, or like that I'm a good coach or whatever it is. And so then when I got out of that program, I had a major crash. Like I had a major collapse. So I was in a hyper trauma response, which is like the fight or flight response. So like I had a lot of like, I was in like sympathetic overdrive where I was just like, go, 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 go. The thing about people who their common like way of playing out their trauma is like this hyper aroused way, this sympathetic overdrive way, is like there is always an inevitable crash. Whether that happens, early in life or later in life, it doesn't really matter. Like it will happen. Like I've never seen someone in sympathetic overdrive where they didn't have a crash at some point in time. My crash came early in life. So I did this program, and then I had this massive collapse. Not just like physically, like it was like I just was exhausted. I had chronic fatigue. I had adrenal fatigue. I had like major health issues, major digestion issues. There was like a period of time, almost 2 years, where I like could barely get out of bed. Like walking even just a mile was like the most exhausting thing that, it was just like kind of hard to even comprehend. Like I lost so much weight. Like at my lowest, I was like 105 pounds, like not like I couldn't digest anything. It was just like my whole body just shut down and was basically like, no. And so then that sent me on this much deeper, like I'd already studied trauma from a more cognitive place, like in grad school, like that was what my whole degree was around, but it was like very theoretical. And so then that sent me on this more somatic and energetic trauma resolution like journey where I started doing a lot of like somatic experiencing work or doing like my teacher mentor Bridget Vixens does a program called Alchemical Alignment, which I highly recommend. It's freaking phenomenal. And I started doing more like even like slower body work, like craniosacral work, or like, and then I started working with my mentor Tim, who does really deep level energy work and like understanding energetic, like your electromagnetic field and how kind of like, and there's like energetic trauma patterns that we're creating, like carrying inside of ourselves just as much as body ones. And through that whole journey of basically trying to heal myself through all these things, I started really understanding how all the previous work I'd done, like the 4 or 5 years of like all this embodiment work, actually led me to that point. And so then I became very focused on, well, if I want to offer this work to the world, I will say I kind of took off. I stopped working for a couple of years in there because I was just like, this feels so out of integrity. Like, how do I offer this work in a way that doesn't harm people? And it took me a while to figure that out. So I stopped offering group programs. Especially I was still working one-on-one clients because I felt like I could do that in a one-on-one context, but in group context it was confusing for me. And so I took a couple years off doing group programs until I got to this place where I was like, oh, this is how I can offer this work, but through this super, super intentional, very attuned way of offering this work that actually teaches people how to trust their body and teaches them that like how to find safety, how to find that like stability inside of themselves before we ever even touch some like super energetic practice, or even before they ever even touch their pussy or touch whatever body parts they're working with. And that was, it was kind of like, oh, this is the work I wish I had. And I didn't have it, and I'm okay with that because that journey was like important and necessary for me. But it was just like, oh my goodness, like if I could start over, this is what I wish I had started with. Yeah. So that's a little bit of my journey, but also how it impacted my work, I suppose.
Yeah. Thank you. Oh my God. There's so many things I'm like, oh, I want to go there. Well, and, you know, my understanding of like kind of the history of the people who were the first kind of immigrants to the US is like purity culture is part of it. And so is this like puritanical, or I'm saying, yeah, that's the same word, but like working really hard. And so it's like we have to work hard in order to be accepted by God and maybe that's not even guaranteed in life, but the fruit that you can literally labor in this lifetime. So it makes so much sense that those two things were like parallel in your system. And it's like, let me work to get on the other side of this when you were trying to address your trauma. And of course, like, you know, we have these embodied patterns of like, yes, I'm going to go pedal to the metal, type A, 100%, probably 125% if I had to guess. And that inevitable burnout, which is like, it's such a classic tale, and people have different, like the details of the story arc can be different, but like the going so hard that your body eventually says enough, you haven't listened, I'm now saying enough. Like, wow, I suspect a lot of people will deeply resonate that. And I'm also hearing like such a clear example of what a hyper activated state is chronically, and then what that hypo activated state is like, and your body's just saying, nope, we actually do not have any resources because we were too hyper for too long.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that hypo, you know, it could look different for different people. It could be like intense depression. It could be like kind of chronic fatigue or illness, but it could also just be like apathy and like a lack of interest in life and the world. You know, I think a lot of just chronic anything that's sort of like down and like is often the nervous system trying to recover from like you said, like societal's expectations on us to do so much. And also like that, what a piece of what you said made me think about just like how so many of us do come to healing work or do come from this background of like we're something to fix. And I know that that was me for sure. Like I signed up for that coaching program with this mentality of like I'm going to fix myself. Like, and how that mentality actually truly led to this experience. And it also kept me so stuck in the healing cycle because I was constantly being like, oh, it's not working. I'm not fixing myself. Like I'm not fixed yet. I'm not healed yet. And it was actually that kept me so trapped and kept me so stuck in seeking out things that were actually dangerous for me or unhelpful for me because I had such a strong, like, there's something supremely wrong with me that I need to fix mentality that I think comes from culture, comes from religion, comes from all of these different backgrounds.
Yeah, and I've experienced that too. And honestly, like sometimes my brain can still go there if I have an expectation of what a practice should do, and if it doesn't meet that expectation, and then I immediately there's a voice that can easily go into the like, oh well, something wrong with you then, and it's like whoa 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 whoa, and like now I can like lovingly give compassion to that part, but it's like you're digging this hole of despair and suffering and of the nervous system seeing your body and everything as like wrong and scary and broken.
Exactly. Yeah, it like becomes a threat. It's like then we're just like in a threat response all the time because we're like have such a high expectation for ourselves, an unrealistic expectation for ourselves. And then we don't meet that expectation because of course we wouldn't. It's like inhuman. But then we feel so disappointed in ourselves and then that threat cycle continues. Um yeah, and I think that's why like I'm all for like pussy liberation and like expansiveness and like feel like a goddess, but I also think there's a danger that like most sexuality work, at least in sort of these spiritual realms or self-development worlds, is marketed from that place. And that's something I actually try really hard not to do because it sets up that expectation, and then that really literally leads people to be like, oh well, if I can't be a sex goddess at the end of this like 3-week course, there's something like messed up with me. And it's just like, that is like the most unrealistic expectation that ever like exists. Like, it's just like for most people, some people that'll be fine because I think it's just not their karma in this lifetime to like have to deal with that. But for most people, for the vast majority of people, a 3-week course will not suddenly make you become a sex goddess. Like it just won't.
Yeah. Well, and at what point does like the desire to be a sex goddess become performative and not honoring like where your body's actually at? And maybe on that Thursday night, you're like, I actually just want to watch Netflix, or I just want to cuddle with my partner. Right. And yet now here I am being like, well, I've learned all these practices, so I have to, it's my sexuality is wrong if I cannot get into that sex goddess state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
It makes me curious.
And also like,
oh yeah. Go. You
go.
No,
I was just going to say, like, the idea of, like, what a sex goddess even is. It's, like, that's such, like, a limited idea. It's, like, what if a sex goddess is someone who's, like, so highly attuned to their body that they can, like, say their needs anytime they want? Like, what if that's a sex goddess, Like, I think it's also just this, like, mindset of what that even is. But, yeah, I'm super curious what you were going to say before I launched into that.
Yeah. No, thank you for that, because I definitely think, I mean, we can kind of go on these like extremes of like, well, now I have to perform what a tantric sex goddess is because that's what sexual liberation is, versus how can I learn from this lineage? How can I learn these practices and then, integrate them as suits me? Which brings me to my question, which is, right. It sounds like you took a lot of time off from work and from the more pointed sexuality work, and you went into more trauma resolution, but like what actually was needed and happened for you and your nervous system that really shifted things? And I'm sure it was not a one and done, but what was that journey like? Since it wasn't maybe, doing an hour of tantric practices every day.
Yeah. I mean, so the crash was a big part of it because I came to a place of like not being able to do that. It was just like, oh, I literally physically cannot do that. I cannot perform in life the way that I used to perform. But also, and I don't recommend this for others, but so I don't know how much you know about human design, but like I'm a 1-3 on human design. And so I'm very much someone who has to like learn through experience. So the one line is like my understanding. I'm not a human design expert, but like the one line is very like research oriented. Like you have to, like, you just want to go, go, go. No, 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 no. And then the 3 line, I think this is the way it is. The 3 line is like, you have to experience life in order to like learn something. And not everyone is that way. Like they just aren't, but I am. And so when I had that crash, it was simultaneously at the same time of having that major health crash, I also got into a wildly abusive relationship with someone who was, it was like very psychologically abusive, very emotionally abusive, but also very psychically abusive. So he's like an energy wizard. And yeah, it was like very, very intense experience. And it was honestly like through being in that relationship, so I was in that relationship for a year and a half, that like birthed, and like I don't recommend, like I said, don't recommend that. But for me personally, it really birthed this like soft, gentle, like I must like cling to like who I am part of me that just like I couldn't quite ever get to prior to that. And it's like because I was always looking for this outside validation or this outside like signifier of my self-worth. And so even getting in, when I got out of that relationship, I look back at it and I was just like, how did that happen? Like I'd been doing trauma work for years, like 7 years, like at that point, like studying trauma extensively. And like I'd done so much work on like naming my needs, and I'd done so much work like on all of these different ways. And I was like, how did I end up in that situation? And granted, he was like, he was very sophisticated in his ways, and like very much didn't very deceptive in who he was. But also I realized this because I still was so badly seeking that outside validation and that outside sense of like self-worth and an outside person to tell me who I was and what I was feeling. So he was this like wizard who could feel like someone could walk in a room and he knows their core wound, and he could be like, oh, your liver's not working well. Like he can see the energy plane. And it took being in that kind of dynamic where someone was literally telling me what I thought, what I felt, what I experienced, what I was even doing like behind the scenes, to be like, no, like I am the only person who can figure that out for myself. And I have got to stop looking for that in outside people and outside places and outside modalities. Like, just fuck no. And when I got out of that relationship, it was just, I literally went into like a 2-year period of time where I was just dedicated to myself. And it was just like, and like, I kind of went to the other extreme where I was just like, I will not let anyone tell me anything about me. Like, I actually like have major, major, major boundaries, probably like over boundaries. But when you do that cycle of like being way too far on one side, you have to go to that pendulum swing of like going way too far on the other side. And in that time, it was just like, I honestly would say the biggest thing for me was just like validating my experience, which like sounds so simple, and honestly it is so simple, but it's just this like acknowledging my feelings when I was feeling them, acknowledging my sensations when I was feeling them, like acknowledging what was going on, and then literally saying to myself, that makes so much sense. Like, it makes so much sense that you feel that way right now. It makes so much sense that your body is literally shaking because you're so anxious, because you're terrified that this dude is going to find you again. Like, it makes so much sense that you feel nervous every single time you walk into a public spiritual space because you are essentially in a cult. Like, it makes so much sense that like you have resistance to going to practitioners or to healers because you experience a very abusive experience in that context. It was like I just validated and validated and validated and validated, and like literally would just make myself right over and over and over again. And it transformed so much for me, and it really helped me. I mean, I wouldn't say like I'm cured, but honestly, I feel like, I was saying to someone, like, I feel like I'm a different person. And they're like, I don't think you're a different person. I just think you're actually so much more who you are. Like, you
There's
just
like
don't people
layers
please
that
anymore.
you shed. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're like, it's not that you're a different. I mean, maybe it feels like you're a different person, but it's just like you're so much more connected to who you are,
Yeah.
that like you're just showing up so much more authentically. And I really feel that way. It just feels like I enter into spaces, I enter into programs, I enter into healing work just so much more attuned to myself in such a profound way. But it took an experience of being so profoundly disconnected from myself to finally like flip that switch.
Yeah. Well, we have a security alert going off, so I don't know if you hear that. I hear that.
I do not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fun one. I
Do you need to go check on it?
it basically pulled me out of my AirPods.
Uh-huh.
Me That's so wild. I knew that they were doing one, but I didn't think it would come on my computer.
Yeah, I am hearing an echo, which I wasn't hearing before, but ever since you said the security list alert,
Yeah, I can't hear you in my. Okay. If I is there an echo when I speak?
not when you speak,
Okay.
but when I speak, I'm hearing an echo.
Oh, yeah. See, this is the issue. God damn it. This is the annoying thing is okay, here, let me try this now. It doesn't like when like the devices change midway through. Ooh, connect. Okay.
Right.
Okay, now we're back. Okay.
And I'm
Wow.
not hearing an echo, so
Awesome.
it works.
Cool. Yeah. We've had quite the tech. Also, I'm by a window and whenever the light comes, it's like angels are shining upon me.
I was
Cool.
having that experience too. I like moved over here because I was like, oh, there's a rainbow on my face right now.
Yeah, I was like, okay, I guess I need curtains that aren't blackout curtains. Like I need a middle one to just soften it.
Right.
Cool. Well, we had a little intermission. Do you need to use the restroom or anything while have a lull?
I feel okay. Yeah, I
Okay.
just took a sip
Yeah.
of water. That felt nice.
Cool. Yeah, totally. Awesome. Okay, well, I don't know. I don't remember where exactly we were, and I don't know if that picked up that recording, but obviously we will splice this little intermission out. Do you remember what you were saying?
I think I just said that that like I had to go like so far in the experience of being completely disconnected from myself
Yeah.
to be able to go into an experience of just like absolute commitment to only being connected to myself. Like not only, but you know, to just like know like this
First
like I
and
have
foremost.
to care about this first and foremost. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, and I also want to kind of draw the connection that I'm seeing back to religions and religious trauma, even if it doesn't feel like a capital T trauma, but growing up being told you have to align your actions, your thoughts, your behaviors, your relationships to meet these standards in order to be loved and accepted. And if you don't, you are not welcome here. And either the things that are directly said of like homosexuality is a sin or whatever are the things unsaid of like we just don't talk about that. Like that creates this dynamic of seeking external validation. And I mean, it's so insidious. And I think even, again, it's like, even if someone's like, oh, I don't have religious trauma, it's like, you have been socialized in an embodied way through being in those spaces. And of course, then when we also go to these healing spaces where someone is like, I have all these tools, I have these amazing practices, and maybe it's more new or maybe it's kind of very lineage based. It's like, and they are powerful and you experience them. And so you're like, oh my gosh, like you're orienting, you're leaning in, you're like, how do I align with this power, with these powerful practices and teachers? So it's like of course you ended up where you ended up. And it sounds like your kind of dharma is to experience these extremes and then like find and then like carve out this path for others of a more kind of grounded, rooted way forward.
Yeah, that feels very accurate. And I totally agree with you about how culturally in religion and even just in our culture, like we're so set up to look to others for the answers. I mean, even, and to ignore our own body signals and cues. Like, even if you think about children going to school, like, at least when I was a kid at school, you had to ask permission to go to the bathroom, and like a teacher could deny you access to that. And it's just like, that's a primal need. Like, going pee in a toilet is a primal need. And like, yet we're, even to that degree, we're set up in a culture where even that you have to get permission for, or there's a certain time for it, or there's a certain way for it. There's all these ways that we're taught to neglect our body, but to also look to others for answers. And I very much had sort of like a guru complex, or like I pedestaled people pretty strongly. Like, I was pretty convinced that other people did have the answer, and I would really get swept into someone's magnetism, or someone's like conviction, or their confidence about something being like the way. And it took many years for me to be like, no, like, like there are brilliant people out there, and like, I'm not gonna put them on pedestals. Like, and that really, in the past couple of years, any kind of program I'm in, any kind of learning I'm in, any kind of retreat I go to, I'm very much like, take what works for you and leave the rest. And not like, oh, this person has all the answers, or they know all the ways, or like, even if I like disagree with, you know, even if they're like, you have to be like 100% here the whole time, I'm like, no, I don't. Like, if I need to go take a rest and lay down in my bed, I will. And like that's your issue if you have conflict with that. Like, I don't have, like, there's actually, like, I am a sovereign being, and I get to make sovereign choices.
Beautiful. Yeah, well, I mean, there's a few roads I feel curious about going down, so I'll give you choice, because honoring our choices is a big theme, and our sovereignty. I definitely feel curious about sovereignty, more going deeper there. I feel curious about this concept of a slow burn, and of like finding your own eroticism, and this the real work that you do, and you have an upcoming group program. And then I'll just throw it out there that we discussed potentially talking about smut and how it played a role, and maybe all of these things weave together. So I'll let you pick which door you want to go down.
Yeah, you know, I do think they all weave together. So I think I'll start in the like slow burn department, but that has so much to do with sovereignty, and also has to do with reading smut and how helpful that's been on my healing journey. So yeah, I would say like the way that I now offer group work, and I'm saying group because I do think that, I mean, one-on-one, these patterns can play out in a one-on-one dynamic as well. But I do feel like group programs, because there's that extra layer of like other people in the space, it can really trigger people's fawn response even more. So fawn response, for those who are listening, are like, what's a fawn response? It's like a freeze nervous system response, where it's like a functional freeze, where you like, you're more aware of other people's needs, desires, wants, and like you're conforming your actions, your behavior, your words towards what you assume other people want. Or it might not even be an assumption. Like, for example, someone might say, you're not allowed to leave this space. And so if you have a strong fawn response, you'd be like, I am absolutely not allowed to leave this space. Like, is that actually factually true? Well, no, like you could leave the space. Will something happen if you do? Maybe. But like a strong fawn response would be like, I am literally not allowed to do this, even if everything in my body is screaming to do so. Without the fawn response, you can make much more like sovereign decisions from your own agency and from your own choice. And so where was I going with that? How did I start that? I guess I was just saying that so within a group context, fawning can be so much more common, which leads to people overriding their boundaries. So in all of my spaces, I like the first portion like of my like slow burn program, for example, is all about what is my right pace, what is like my most doable steps for my body, what is my no, how do I find that no, And so even to the point of like, I refuse to turn on my camera in this program, or I actually am not going to do any of the homework in this program. I'm just going to listen the whole time, or I'm going to give myself permission. If it feels like too much, I'm going to walk away from it, which is so antithetical to what most programs say, which is like, if you have resistance, like that means you have to lean into it. Where I'm like, if you have resistance, let's look at it as wise. Let's look at it as something that is having a really smart message for you. And let's listen to that message and let's honor that message. And then let's find like the doable, if you don't want to be in the resistance, okay, then what could be the most doable step for you to move away from that resistance? And whatever you think that doable step is, cut it in half, because I guarantee you, you're actually thinking too big. So, instead of doing a 30-minute practice, let's do a 2-minute practice instead of, whatever the things are. And so it's like really slowing everything down. And what that does is it actually builds your capacity, and it builds your capacity to actually hold the energy. So whether that's sexual energy, or that's just like life energy, your own life force energy, or that's just like going on a walk energy, like being able to like do things that feel fun to you energy. But it's like by slowing everything down, going at your right pace, going at your most doable like ways, it's slowly actually creating that capacity for that fire or for that burn, in a way that will actually work for you and your body, not in some way that some teacher or leader thinks it should be or needs to be or ought to be.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love this concept of finding your no. How can people start to feel into like, what is my no? How is my body telling me that this thing, this situation, this ask, this practice is a no?
Yeah. So most of us have a freeze response around our no, especially if we have had trauma, or we are more prone to be kind of like people pleasing, like that in the fawning energetics. So we won't even know, like we won't even hear a no. So one of the things like I do from a practitioner standpoint is I create a massive field of permission, meaning that I give those options. And I do, and this comes from an energetic standpoint, because I think you can say something. Like I could say to people, your resistance is allowed here. But if I don't energetically actually feel inside of my body that their resistance is allowed here, I will still communicate to them. I'm saying that verbally, but actually it's not. Like actually, if you have resistance, there's going to be an issue. And so one of the things for me is like, I actually truly, like if someone is walking out of like a breathwork practice, I mean, I'll tell them like, can you have a communication with me? Can you have a conversation with me? But I'm going to assume that's actually what they need.
Yeah.
If someone's in like some like dance space and they're feeling like super overwhelmed by other people's energy and they're like, I just need to leave. I'm like, hell yeah, you leave. Like, congratulations. Way to listen to your body. I'm not like, oh, but you're missing the thing. You're missing the point. You're missing the opportunity. It's like, no, like that is their practice. Like that might be like if someone lays on the ground during a breath work and doesn't do the like thing they're supposed to do the whole time, how do I not know that that's exactly the practice that they needed? Like I'm just going to assume that that was the exact practice that they needed. So I think for people to find their no, they have to have actual, true, authentic, not just verbal but energetic permission to be in their no, to explore their no. So I think that's one piece of it. I think like thinking of times, like this is kind of an intense practice, but like thinking of times that you didn't say no and that you wanted to say no. And then can you give yourself permission to say that no in that space, in a similar situation? And I always tell people like, in order to get to an authentic yes, you have to know your no. And so often there is a period of time, like I said, like when I was in an abusive relationship, like my boundaries were so overridden that then I had super rigid boundaries. And the coolest thing about that was like I knew so much about nervous system dynamics that I didn't shame myself for that. I was just like, no, I just have to be like a fuck no to everything until I'm not. Yeah. And allowing that and not shaming myself for that, actually, I think like so many people are like, you healed from that relationship so fast. And I feel that way inside myself. And I really truly feel it's because I gave myself so much permission and I honored my no, even when it seemed irrational, even when it seemed kind of like ridiculous on some level. It was just like, because me honoring that eventually helped me come into more of that equilibrium. And I started feeling little yeses. And I'd be like, oh, I don't have the same level of resistance to that thing that I used to have. I don't have like the same level of like, get away from me that used to be there. Oh, isn't that intriguing? Isn't that interesting? Well, I wonder if I just do a little doable step towards that thing that used to terrify me. And again, like that's what expands someone's capacity.
Yeah. Yeah. We can't access our yes if we can't access our no. And to your point, I recognize that if I'm avoiding something, it means it's a no, and it means it feels too scary to actually say no, or I don't feel like I have the agency, or I'm avoiding the discomfort and the sensations related to saying no, or there's uncertainty. It's not a fuck yes. Maybe it's not a full no, but it's clearly not a yes. And so like, what are the ways in which our body tells on us and tells us like, this is a no. That's actually a no. I love that.
Yeah. I love what you said too about just like, oh, even if there's an uncertainty here, I think so many of us like shame ourselves for that uncertainty. And it's like, well, what if I actually just like listened to that uncertainty and like created compassion for that uncertainty and care and got curious about it? And yeah, I often find my authentic yes through that curiosity around the no.
Yeah. And, like consent is a spectrum. So sometimes when we're in that middle, it might be a no to the exact thing, but what if is there a different yes? And sometimes it's like, oh, well, I feel curious and I want to lean into this. And other times it's like, I feel curious and I want to pull away so I can really honor the parts that are saying no. And especially for folks who experience sexual trauma, like navigating that can be really hard. And that's why I love that you start with this real sovereignty so that folks it sounds like they can like learn to navigate that spectrum before you go anywhere further.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like, how do you learn to attune to your body's signals, to your body's messages, to your body's sensations, feelings, experiences, before you even go into these spaces or do a practice or have someone share something with you. I love what you said too about like consent and like there's a spectrum, and I'm really into like talking about like attunement almost more so than consent, because I think the consent conversation obviously important, like it's very important to like ask someone consent and like to hear the yes or the no, but often like I said, like consent, the conversation of consent is like such a mental concept. And it's like, actually, there's so much more going on in the body. I think teaching people how to attune to each other's systems and like feel resistance in people's bodies. Because there might be like a resistance to something that someone proposes, but it might not include a complete no. There might be like I said, a more doable step in there.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, maybe I'm a no to penetration, but I might actually be a big yes to like receiving a massage. And then from there, I don't know where it'll go, but at least I can like know that in my body. And if someone else is learning this too, they can also start feeling in my own body and feel the resistance and it doesn't even have to be a verbal conversation. Like consent doesn't have to just exist on the verbal plane. I understand why society wise we start there, but it's like there's so many more layers to it.
No, that attunement is huge. And I had an experience like maybe a year ago where someone was really good about asking for consent, but they totally lacked attunement. And so I found myself going into more freeze and fawn and consenting, but more from a place of like more neutral curiosity. But then feeling frustrated because things would like escalate, or there wasn't, it felt very much like, if you're familiar with the wheel of consent, like they were giving but for them and not actually for me, and it was lacking attunement, and I was bypassing myself and not having my own sovereignty and attunement with my own self. And I was frustrated with this person who had the cognitive concept of consent but not the ability to attune. And so now it's
Right.
like, for me, being able to somatically attune with each other is like step one. Like, you do not get to pass go. There is no like that, like sensing into that in subtle ways when I first date someone is so huge for me. And
Yeah.
that also involves my own attunement and me knowing
Exactly.
and sensing what I'm feeling and communicating that, because you can't, it's a big responsibility to ask someone to always over index on attuning to you. And to me, it involves both people like feeling each themselves and feeling each other.
Exactly. Yeah, I always say like you can't actually authentically attune to someone else if you don't know how to attune to yourself. Um, because that skill comes from within, like it comes from being able to do it within your own being. So yeah, it should never be put on the other person to like do that for you or to like always know like what you're thinking or feeling. But there is also this like you said, like this really special mutual relationship that can happen through that level of attunement. I was actually just talking to some friends about like sometimes like the way that society has trained men to have like this idea that like giving a woman like 500 orgasms is like the goal, or maybe not 500 but 5, or like being that's like what makes you a good lover. And we were saying like actually like we would take someone who's like highly attuned over like giving us 5 orgasms any day. And that might be a personal place or a personal perspective, but I truly feel that it's like no, like I
Yeah, so I totally agree with you that we really can't like attune, like in order to be attuned to another, we actually need to be attuned to ourselves, and that's like the first and foremost step. And I think that's why starting this work from that place of like, oh, okay, it's like, yeah, of course we live in a culture, in a world where like no one is attuned to each other because none of us are taught to do that with ourselves. But it's interesting because I do find like at this point in time in I think like there's a lot of pressure on men, if we're like going by like heteronormative standards, a lot of pressure for men in our world and society to like be good lovers. And, a lot of men think that's like, okay, I can give my woman like 5 orgasms and like, then I'll be a good lover. But like, I'm actually at the place, I was just having this conversation with some friends over the weekend. Like, it's like, I want just like an attuned lover. Like, I don't care how many orgasms. You can give me 0 orgasms. I don't give a hoot. But like, if you can attune to me, and because you've attuned to yourself and we can like be in that flow together, like give me that. That's what I care about at this point in time. And I care about another's like responsiveness to my own system and being able to take my own needs like not on a personal level. So if I'm like, ooh, actually that's too much, or like I'm not ready for penetration, or whatever it might be, that there isn't like a that they don't take that on as like, oh, there's something wrong with me, or I did something wrong or bad or whatever, but that they can actually be like, okay, cool, let's show up for this experience. What is the doable step that we can do together right now? What is like the way that we can be intimate in the here and now? And in the past couple years, that's been like my big practice in sexual situations, is like, how do I show up to what is so real for me and like not push past my boundaries, not push past my capacity, but also be so attuned to myself that I can say, hey, that's too much for me right in this moment, but I could do this, like, ooh, I can't, I really can't go there, but I can go here. And like, could we see what flow happens if we do that? And really finding the people who can respect that and show up for it and find enjoyment in showing up for it and don't take it personally, and don't go into their own collapse by hearing a no.
Yeah. Which all of that, like you said, requires radical attunement with self, and
Exactly.
really shedding like these scripts of what sex should look like, which we all have from movies, from media, from culture. But then again, when you go into these spaces of tantra and whatever, you take on new sexual scripts, and it's like,
Right.
what if instead we were radically present to like what's alive for both of us, what's emergent, what could intimacy look like in this present moment, and not, you know, what it has looked like.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Give me that. That's yummy.
Yeah. And I'm gonna take that with me of like, I want an attuned lover. Nothing else actually matters. And
Right.
I think orgasms are much most likely with an attuned lover than someone who, like, has all the tricks and tools.
Precisely. Yep. Yeah. I was just thinking I could add smut into that if you want to go that direction.
I would love that. Let's do it.
So like part of my journey has been like the slow burn, which is why I call my program that. But it's like, how do I slow down my system and attune to my own self, which then actually gives me the opportunity to expand my capacity. And a big piece of doing that has been reading smut or like I'm really into the romantasy genre, which is like fantasy and romance mixed together, but a lot of it has a lot of like sex scenes, I guess, like erotica essentially. And what has been so healing for me is, one, most of these books are written by women, and at least all the books that I read really center like the woman's experience. And so like all of them include like tons of oral sex for women, like, you know, and like lots of foreplay, like an hour of foreplay before penetration and like all of this. But it was so healing for me. Like I was not like, because I had so much trauma from that previous romantic relationship, I just wasn't in any space or mind frame, or I had no capacity to be with someone on a sexual level. And I knew that. I was very aware of that. And instead of like pushing myself to get somewhere I wasn't, I really honored myself in that. But in this time of like deep freeze around my sexuality and just being, even towards myself, like I just did not want to touch myself for like almost a year. And I just let that be. Like I was just like, you know what? You've had your boundaries so overridden. Like what if you just like stop? But then like being able to read these books and like read these like sexual scenes that were like so like attuned, like that they were really about the female experience. They were like so much foreplay and like so conscious of the attunement and really listening to each other's bodies, that like I slowly could feel my own sexuality like awakening inside of me. And then I could start touching my own self and like having my own self-pleasure practices. And then slowly from that place, I started being able to engage with other people. And I realized that like reading smut actually opened me up so much. And that was exactly like the doable step that I needed towards my healing. And it also gave me the capacity and like the training for like what I really wanted in sexual relationships. So it gave me almost a standard, like reading all of these like, you know, books about this experience gave me like a standard of like, okay, I like want this and it's possible. And so how do I, you know, not just automatically expect someone to show up that way, but communicate clearly enough with a person and to see if that person is willing to do the work to help us get to that place or not. You know, do they just shut down to it or call me crazy or whatever? Okay, great information to have. I don't have to take that personally. I can just be like, okay, not the space I want to be in. And so, yeah, it's really interesting for me to reflect like on this like little smut obsession that I've had and like how profoundly healing that's been for me and how much that fits into this like concept and idea of the slow burn.
I love that. Well, and yeah, absolutely. It sounds like such a right-sized, doable step when you're taking a break from, you know, self and other sexual exploration and connection, and you're not feeling that fire within you. And I mean, yeah, like I love fantasy, so why not a little sexy fantasy and then letting your body awaken to that. And I do think like, yeah, I mean, media shapes what we perceive as possible, including fantasy helping us grapple with, you know, with things. And so how beautiful is it that it helped kind of show you like, you could get an hour of foreplay before penetration. It doesn't have to be the bare minimum or whatever. That's
right.
Amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything else you want to say about just the concept of slow burn and self-intimacy and kind of all of those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is like its roots are really just in like, how do I come home to myself? Like, how do I come home to living inside of this vessel? And I think like that's really the core of like all the work I do is like, we've suffered from disconnection in so many ways. I mean, even being birthed into the world is like a traumatic experience. Like, it's a disconnect from source. It's a disconnect from mother. Like, and we've all had like, we all experience disconnection in so many ways. And like what I have found, at least on my journey, is that like finding that connection within and really being able to land inside your own being and like to find home from within, like to marry yourself, is actually what leads to then profound connection outside of self too. And I did my journey, you know, seeking that connection with other so much more than seeking it within self, because I had my belonging wounds, because I had my cult trauma, because I had all these things. So I was always looking for that external space, like always looking for like, or, you know, that book, like, are you my mother? Are you my mother? You know, I didn't know I was doing that, but like on an unconscious level, I was. It was just like, I was always looking for like, where's my home? Where's my belonging? Where's my community? Where's my people? Where's my teacher? Where's my guru? And I was like, oh, actually, it's like, how do I build a home inside of my being? And, you know, Slow Burn is a sexuality program. It does teach you concepts. It does like teach you somatic practices. But I think like the core of it is like, how do I come home to myself? And I think that's like the profundity of at least what people who have gone through that program, like what they've experienced inside of their own being. And like what that means to each person can be uniquely different too. There's no like, this is the outcome or this is the goal. Like, I think that's the coolest thing about Slow Burn is there is no goal. Like, the goal is just like, can you be 5% more connected to yourself than you were before you came into this space? And if that's 50% more connected, cool, but that doesn't matter. Like, the goal is 1%, you know, it's just like, can you just be a sliver of a bit more connected to yourself than you were before? Then you're winning, you know?
Yep. Yeah, you absolutely are winning if that's, if 1% more connected or however much more. Yeah, and for folks, you know, who maybe can't join, what is a way that they can start to come home to themselves or start to walk that path?
Yeah, I think beginning to validate, like I said kind of before, but I find like so many times we unconsciously gaslight our own experience. And we make ourselves wrong for our feelings, and we make ourselves wrong for our experiences or our expressions. And I really feel like the very first step is like, how can I make myself make sense? Like, how can I make what I'm experiencing right now make sense? And I think a lot of people don't want to do that because they've like really enmeshed emotions and behaviors. So it's like, well, I'm not allowed to feel angry because in the past I've seen angry people do bad things, you know, like that's like kind of the mindset or the mentality. But it's like, actually, like our emotions and our behaviors are separate. You can be angry for a very, very valid reason, and that doesn't mean that you have to go punch someone in the face. And so like, and actually I think you'll be less inclined to punch someone in the face if you can actually validate your anger and be like, it makes so much sense that I'm angry right now and that I have a fire burning inside of my body. And so many of us are like afraid to actually feel our sensations inside of our body because we're afraid of what will happen if we actually feel that energy. And I have found like the most like primal beginning steps is just like, how do I validate myself? Like, how do I actually make myself make sense? And how to like every expression that happens to me, just like, oh, I'm feeling a twinge in my heart. Okay, how do I make that make sense? Yeah, like, of course you're feeling that right now. This is a lot. You know, that really hurt that one time, and now you're feeling the pain of it. Okay, can I just, like, be with it and not make myself wrong for it?
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, anything else you want to share, discuss before we move into a wonderful somatic practice that you're going to guide us in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. It's just been fun talking about this work, and I appreciate your own knowledge and experience too. And yeah, it just feels so juicy to like have these conversations because I feel like they're not being had on the level that I would love to see. And it's like the more we can move in this direction, I really truly feel the more we can just like show up with so much more love and compassion in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I want to thank you for the work that you're doing because, yeah, you know, I feel like there's been some disappointment for me dipping my toe into the sexuality space and feeling like, oh, you know, I actually can't be supported in a trauma, you know, oriented way. And so
Right.
anytime I see folks who are having the nuance that you're having, I'm just like, yes, woo. So cheering you on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the nuance. I think that's so key. It's like, oh yeah, so many shades of gray. It's not black or white.
No. And we'll have all the links below for people to connect with you more. And yeah, I mean, you've mentioned slow burn, but do you want to give us kind of a quick, like, details on what it looks like for anyone who's curious?
Yeah, so Slow Burn is a 5-month long coaching container. It's a group program. We had 20 people in the last round. And it's a combination of workshops and coaching calls and then practice calls. And I have 2 assistant coaches in the container too, so it's also an extremely supportive space. So for a group container, you still have a lot of like one-on-one interaction if you choose to have that. And it's a lot of like, there's 4 modules inside the program. And so the first one is like connecting with self. The second one is sort of like somatic trauma resolution principles and like how do I move like trauma throughout my body. I'm forgetting what the third one. There's like one. The fourth one though is on like connecting with other. Like how do I do this work with someone else, or if I'm prone to codependency or I'm prone to fawning, like how do I actually do this work with someone? How do I stay inside myself or inside my own sovereign experience? And so it's really profound container. It's super, super in-depth. There's such a wide space of permission, and it really is like go at your own pace. I originally did it for 4 months, but I changed it to 5 just to give a little bit more integration in between the modules this time. Yeah, and we start, you can sign up basically anytime in October. We do have our opening ceremony like October 11th, but I'm leaving it open for a couple weeks after that. So nice. People can still come into the space. And it's also like, it is a live taught program, like it teaches live, but I had plenty of people in the last run who just did it all on their own and in their own pace and own timing. And they all had like equally profound experiences. So if one is intimidated by the live component, they don't have to show up live.
Yeah. I want to +1 on that. Like it might take a little more commitment of like, okay, I will do this, but I've
right.
been in similar situations where you still get a ton out of it.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. And it gives people that option. Like some people were just like, some people worked and so they couldn't make the call times, but some people were just like, I actually like, it will be too overwhelming to be in a group space around this. And I was like, cool, don't be in the group space around it. Like you get full permission to do it how you need to do it. And I also have a lot of space where they can message me or, you know, like it's not like they're not included in the process.
Yeah. Beautiful. Awesome. Well, I believe you have a somatic practice for us.
Yeah. So when Jaclyn asked me to do this somatic practice, like my first thought was like, oh, I just actually want to do something simple because I think that's like what a lot of the work out there is missing. Like it's like, sure, we can have this like hour-long ritual and we can, you know, pray to the goddess and then like do all this energy work inside our body, but I have found the simple, small, easy, doable practices have actually been the most profound, like helpful practices for me. So this is just like a orienting and stabilizing practice. And just to give a little background to it, when we live with chronic trauma or when we have like sympathetic, like overdrive happening inside of our system, we're used to chaos. We're actually kind of maybe I wouldn't say like looking for chaos, but we seem to find ourselves in a lot of chaos. We're used to like high energy. We're used to lack of stability. And what orienting and stabilizing can do is it can just give you like a sliver of like, oh, what is possible. And sometimes oftentimes I should say, like when I start working with one-on-one clients, they have so much resistance because they're like, this is boring. And I'm like, yeah. Like it's mundane. And like, how profound can boring or mundane be when you have been living in total chaos? And so it's actually in the boring or in the mundane that we can start helping our nervous system go into more of a parasympathetic nervous system response instead of the like sympathetic overdrive. So the first thing I invite one into is actually just looking around your room, or maybe you have a window, or like wherever you are. Maybe you're driving and listening to this. You can just see if you can orient yourself to something inside of your space that feels, it could feel safe, but it doesn't have to. It could feel grounding. It might just feel like heavy. So sometimes I like to look at like furniture, like, oh, there's like a really like thick dresser that like there's no way I can move it. Or, oh, like I have a wood floor. I love looking at my wood floor sometimes when I do this. But you just want to find something that feels stable and that is super predictable. And you're just going to hang out with it. And that might sound weird. But like, so right now I'm just looking at my floor, my wood floor, and I'm just noticing the wood, that it comes from the earth. I'm noticing how I don't have to question if my floor is going to be there or not. It's literally always here. And I wake up in the morning and it's here, and I go to bed at night and it's here. I don't have to question if it's going to hold my body up. Like I can walk on this floor and nothing happens. Like I don't fall through it. It's just there. And so I'm attuning to the floor, meaning I'm like syncing up my own system with that and really noticing the stability of that. If I was like touching it, maybe I would feel the texture of it or like the temperature of it. But you don't have to. You can just observe it too. And from there, maybe expanding out slightly from something more close into your body. Like maybe I start feeling into gravity. And I start noticing, wow, gravity is super predictable. Again, I don't really question gravity. It's just here. And I just start noticing the heaviness of my own body and how it's sitting on the chair that I'm on. And like feeling the sensation or the pressure of like my back against the back of my chair. Or like the holding of the bottom of my chair against my thighs, against my butt, my hips. And I'm again just feeling into the predictability of that and the sensation of that holding. And maybe just exploring, can I feel 1% more in tune with that predictability, with that holding? Maybe I can feel 2% more, but it doesn't have to be that. Yeah. And different things work for different people, so I'm just sort of exploring a range of things. Like another thing can be like nature elements. So me living in the mountains, I often feel into the wide base of support. So again, on an energetic plane, like we were inside the room, we were in the body, and now we're expanding out to nature. And I just imagine the wide base of support of the mountain range that I live on. Perhaps for you, it's like you attune to a tree outside of your window and like that tree trunk and the wide base of like the roots that go out into the earth and how it keeps that tree stable, and that tree can withstand storms. And it can also change, like if you live in a place where there's 4 seasons, the leaves can change color, the leaves can fall. And so for me, tuning into the wide base of support from the mountains, I think about how much those mountains are holding the water, the animals, the trees, the snow, everything. And I just really attune myself to that wide base of support. And I let that resonate inside of my own body. what would it be if I lived with a wide base of support underneath me? And again, even if it's just 2% of me that can feel that, 5% of me that can feel that, we don't have to go 100%. If you're like, wow, I'm really dissociated, that's okay. What if just 1% of you can tune into that? And can we make that valid? Wow, cool, I feel 1% more attuned to this wide base of support. And then just coming back to your body and just noticing, has anything changed from the beginning to where you are now? Doesn't have to be big. Could just simply be like, oh, I feel like I can take a deeper breath. Or maybe it's nothing. Maybe you're like, I feel numb. I felt nothing. That's cool. Can we just allow that to be part of it too? And this is something that you can do like anywhere that you're at. I think that's why it's so brilliant. You know, if you're like at a doctor's office and maybe you're nervous about having, you know, an appointment or a procedure, you can just attune to something that feels stable in the waiting room. Or maybe you're driving to something and you're feeling nervous. Well, maybe you just like attune to the way the leaves are like flickering on trees. I mean, like drive attentively, you know, but like you can attune to something out there. Or like the earth, maybe the earth feels really stable to you. If you're, you know, at home and you're feeling really overwhelmed by something, like can you just look at your floor and feel into the safety of that floor? But the key is really finding something that it doesn't have to feel safe, but that feels predictable. That feels like, oh yeah, like that I'm not going to question a lot. You know, like for some people, earth feels scary for them. Like they can't do it with earth because it feels too unpredictable. For me, I love attuning to the earth. Like that works for me super well. But there's no right or wrong. It's just like what works for you and your body and your nervous system. But if you do this regularly and just small little bits of it, it can have a profound effect in your life as a whole.
Thank you so much for that. I attune to my bed, and it's such a source of comfort and safety for me. Yeah. Thank you.
I love that. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for offering an opportunity to do something.
Well, this has been such a pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much, Jaclyn.